Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Atlantic Council on International Relations webinar on Beijing's tightening squeeze on Taiwan and Hong Kong. We at ACIR hope that each and every one of you, your family and your friends are healthy, well, and safe during this COVID-19 pandemic. If this is your first time to engage in an ACIR program, the Atlantic Council on International Relations is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that promotes understanding through the free exchange of ideas on the complex issues that confront the United States and other nations in the world today. You can visit our website at www.atlantacir.org for details on upcoming events, recent newsworthy articles, and membership opportunities and benefits. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those of you who are members or are familiar with ACIR, thank you for joining us during these difficult times. I would also like to thank our institutional members, the Georgia Institute of Technology and the University of North Georgia, as well as our strategic partner, the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, for their continued support. And from our Atlanta diplomatic community, it is a pleasure to welcome Jean Hanratty, Executive Director of the Hong Kong Trade Office, Daniel Hung, Director of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office, Ellis O'Keefe from the Consulate of Ireland, and John Parkerson, Honorary Consul General of Hungary. I hope I didn't miss anyone. Today, it is our special pleasure to welcome our speaker, Shelley Rigger, Brown Professor of East Asian Politics at Davidson College in North Carolina. Our webinar today falls on a particularly sad day in the course of contemporary history. It was on the late evening of June 3rd, 1989, that the bloodshed at Tiananmen Square began. By the end of June 4th, while estimates vary, somewhere between 218 Beijing government estimates and outside estimates of upward of 2,000 civilians, including many students, were killed by assault rifles and tanks at the hands of the People's Liberation Army in order to end a peaceful protest. Students had called for greater government accountability, constitutional due process, democracy, freedom of press, and freedom of speech. It is against this background and increasing authoritarian rule in Beijing that we examine PRC efforts to expand its control over Hong Kong in apparent violation of the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 that ended British rule in Hong Kong, and to intimidate Taiwan. With us today, to guide us on this journey, we have Professor Shelley Rigger. You have already had an opportunity to read her biographical sketch. However, I would like to highlight some of her background. Professor Rigger earned a BA in Public and International Affairs from Princeton University and a PhD from Harvard University. She has been a researcher at the National Tsingtao University in Taipei, the capital of the Republic of China on Taiwan, as well as at Fudan and Shanghai Jiao Tong University in Shanghai. She is a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She has published several books and articles on Taiwan. Her latest book is titled Why Taiwan Matters, Small Island, Global Powerhouse. She is currently a Fulbright Senior Scholar based in Taipei and Shanghai, where she is working on a study of Taiwan's contribution to the People's Republic of China's economic takeoff. Shelley, welcome. It is a great pleasure to have you join us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you. And I wish I were joining you from Taipei, where I spent the larger part of the past year. But in fact, the Fulbright program sent us home early, or sent me home early, because of the COVID outbreak. So I'm actually joining you from my office here in Davidson, North Carolina, and very happy to be with you. I'm sorry that we're not together in person, but I'm really delighted that the ACIR continues to carry out its programming even in this imperfect and unexpected high-tech way. So I was asked to talk to you today about rising tensions on China's borders. And in fact, we see evidence of militarized tension on China's border with India, in the South China Sea, and in the East China Sea near Japan, at the same time that US-China relations are deteriorating as well. And I'm happy to talk about any of those in the Q&A, but I wanted to use my 30 minutes of filibuster time to say a few words about the 2 points of tension that are closest to China, and that would be Hong Kong and Taiwan. So 7 years or more ago, if you had asked me, as many people have and still do, what do Taiwanese think about Hong Kong? I would have said, they really don't, right? Most people in Taiwan, until relatively recently, viewed Hong Kong as an entirely separate concern. And they did not think of Hong Kong's fate or situation as indicative of anything much for Taiwan. And so they thought, you know, Hong Kong is Hong Kong, it's over there, they're doing their thing. But our situation is very different. We have never been under the sovereignty of the PRC. We were not before, 1997 when Hong Kong was handed over to the PRC, and we are not now. And so Hong Kong's status is so different from our own that it's kind of not a very relevant point of comparison for us. This changed abruptly in 2014 because the protest movement of 2014 in Hong Kong, the umbrella movement, followed immediately after one of the most significant protest movements in Taiwan's modern history, the Sunflower Movement. Both the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan and the umbrella movement in Hong Kong were large, powerful, important political movements that were led by young activists, people who were really getting involved in street politics for the first time. And these young activists saw their struggles as connected to a much greater extent than in previous generations or previous waves of protests. The Sunflower and umbrella activists were engaged in conscious efforts to coordinate, to share information, to work out tactics and strategies together. And even to this very day, there are really strong connections across the activist communities in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And part of the reason for that is that for the first time in a very long time, perhaps ever, the leading activists in Taiwan and in Hong Kong saw themselves as having similar and in fact related causes. For previous generations of Taiwanese political activists, the opponent they were focused on was really internal to Taiwan, basically the other political party. And for previous generations of activists in Hong Kong, the goal was to more fully implement the institutions that they had been promised by the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law of Hong Kong. But for the Sunflower and umbrella movement activists, the opponent they were focused on was still to some extent internal. For Taiwan, the at that time ruling party, the KMT or Kuomintang, and for activists in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong leadership. But both Sunflower and umbrella were very much directed toward Beijing and toward the PRC. So for those young activists in 2014, for the first time in a long time, perhaps for the first time ever, the primary concern was the People's Republic of China and the PRC leadership. And we've seen since 2014 a steady increase in that shared concern about the rise of China in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, and not just among young activists, but increasingly in the societies, the two societies as a whole. Meanwhile, what we see in China is a steady trend toward tighter internal control, and also a steady trend toward tighter control in the way the Beijing government thinks about Hong Kong and Taiwan. And this increase in internal and sort of near external tightening is accompanied by a more outward-leaning, assertive approach to foreign policy. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today for the next 20 to 25 minutes, is some of my thoughts about what may be driving Beijing's approach to Hong Kong and Taiwan and to its foreign policy more broadly, and what this reveals about the PRC's internal situation. And then I'll conclude by saying a little bit about the responses to the PRC policies that we're seeing in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I think for China specialists, the really big question that we're struggling with and have been struggling with for some time for really understanding what is driving Beijing is our effort to discern to what extent China's current policies, both domestic and external, are a reflection of confidence and strength, and to what extent those policies are a reflection of fearfulness and weakness for the leadership. And the strangest or most difficult part of that challenge is that, in fact, it may be both, right? Confidence and fearfulness, strength and weakness all seem to be present in the PRC's current situation, and all seem to be contributing to this increasingly hardline stance in Beijing. So where does the confidence come from or come in? Beginning with the great financial crisis, so 2007, 2008, we saw a definite and discernible, measurable increase in the amount of information circulating within China and coming out of China that suggested an increase in China's feeling of confidence. And this is not just the leadership, but also across the society, this sense that the US was in decline, the West was in decline, and China was looking at an opportunity to increase its global role and its global position and stature. That feeling, that sense of confidence diminished a little bit as the US and other Western economies recovered from the financial crisis somewhat more robustly and quickly than many PRC analysts had anticipated. But there was still this sense that this might be China's moment. Moreover, I think it was very hard once the momentum for a more assertive posture on the global stage had emerged and been endorsed by PRC leaders, that momentum was hard to stop. It had fed a feeling of nationalism, and that feeling of nationalism then became itself a kind of driver of further confidence or further efforts to appear confident, even as the Beijing leadership began to see what difficulties that more assertive posture was creating. In 2012, Xi Jinping came to power in the PRC and further accelerated the trend toward a more assertive foreign policy, and also began to impose a much more stringent and restrictive environment within the PRC. And part of that had to do with how Xi Jinping came to power, the political crisis of the moment in which he took the top office. But I think it also reflected and continues to reflect Xi's own orientation toward governing, which is a highly confident orientation, but also a very he is not a risk-averse politician. He is the opposite of a risk-averse politician. He will take big risks in order to achieve big objectives. And that kind of leadership style really fit well with the zeitgeist in China after the great financial crisis. So we see Xi Jinping's leadership really reflecting both his own sense of confidence in himself and in China's potential, which was reinforced, of course, by China's continuing economic rise and its perpetual successes year on year in expanding its international position through policies like the Belt and Road Initiative, which really put China in South Asia, in Africa, in Central Asia, and on a very large scale. I think the policy approach, especially in terms of foreign policy, that the Xi administration has taken, gained further reinforcement in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump in the United States, who signaled even before the election and then acted upon after the election an agenda of walking back from many of the traditional US global commitments and reducing US engagement with the international order. So, you know, the withdrawing from the WHO is only the last of a long series of ways in which the Trump administration has pulled the US back from international leadership and playing a strong international role. And that has created an opportunity for Beijing that I will talk about in a moment. But I think I also want to take this moment, for a moment, to mention June 4th, 1989. This is the anniversary, the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen crisis. Different people call it different things, but it was definitely a crisis. And I think that if we look at the social media and even the official media from China today, what we see is that any moral leadership that the US might have claimed, at least in China, over events like the Tiananmen crisis is entirely lost, given the situation in the US today. So essentially what people in the PRC are seeing is the US military occupying our capital in the same way that the People's Liberation Army occupied Beijing in 1989, and they no longer recognize that the US has any moral authority to lecture China about Tiananmen or anything else in the face of the civil unrest and the militarized response to it in the United States. So, you know, for 30 years, the US held some moral leverage over China, even among many people within the PRC, because of the Tiananmen crisis. I think we've lost that because of the way our own government is responding to calls for justice in the US. So even if you support Donald Trump overall and what he's doing in terms of foreign and domestic policy, it is a fact that his policies have helped China assume a larger role in the international community, in international organizations, and have undermined efforts internationally to hold the PRC government accountable for its own actions. So all of this, though, does not leave Beijing in a fantastic position. They are not riding high. It's a very tricky and delicate position, in fact, that the PRC finds itself in. On the one hand, it seems that the Beijing leadership is happy to take advantage of this moment to fill the leadership vacuum that exists in the world today. And Xi Jinping, as a leader himself, seems particularly comfortable entering that vacuum. But on the other hand, right, trying to fill a global leadership vacuum carries risks for China. First of all, the PRC may not be ready to fill this vacuum successfully. Its resources are limited. it still has a lot of internal problems. And perhaps most importantly, it did not choose this moment, right? It's being pulled into a more assertive global role, not because it has chosen this moment, but because the opportunity has been created by others, and so the PRC is being pulled in. And this has never been the preferred state of affairs for PRC leadership. For many decades, the Deng Xiaoping logic of lie low, bide our time, don't overreach, don't overplay our hand was the guiding principle for PRC foreign policy. And there were good reasons PRC leaders wanted to follow that approach. So being sort of pulled in to fill a vacuum of leadership internationally has great potential to benefit the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, but it carries risks as well. The PRC's internal problems are primarily economic, but there are political challenges as well, including the difficulties created by Xi's decision to eliminate the limitations of the term limit that he was under when he first took office. Taking away his term limitation creates real challenges in terms of leadership succession and managing internal party conflict. So there are political challenges as well as economic challenges. Also, I think Beijing would like the world to think that it has solved the problem of COVID-19 in China, but unemployment is still very high in many Chinese cities. China's economy is not fully back to normal, and outbreaks of COVID continue to force shutdowns in scattered places around the country. Compared to back in January and early February, there's not a lot of political unrest right now in the PRC surrounding the COVID crisis, but it is difficult to know how much of that is because people are satisfied with Beijing's response to COVID and how much of it is because political unrest is risky right now and the level of repression is very high. I think both are true. There's no doubt that among PRC people, Beijing has benefited enormously from the failure of Western countries, especially the United States, to manage the COVID crisis effectively. So they have a legitimate and I think really plausible case to make to their own people that other countries did worse with COVID than the PRC, and therefore the PRC did okay. Meanwhile, I haven't even mentioned, and I just want to drop a word in here, and we can talk about it more in Q&A if you want to. I haven't even mentioned one of the costliest and riskiest actions of the Beijing government in recent years, which is the crackdown on Islamic minority groups in northwestern China, in Xinjiang. So that's just the sort of overview of the internal problems Beijing is looking at. Externally, I think China is increasingly facing a backlash against its increasing international influence and role, and a backlash against its efforts to use the COVID crisis to improve its international position. Meanwhile, the COVID-induced recession, global depression, has made it likely that many of the countries that owe money to the PRC currently are not going to be able to pay their debts anytime soon. So that just adds to the economic pressure on Beijing. Already a number of debtor nations, especially in Africa, are asking for restructuring of those loans and investments. However, I don't want to overstate the backlash to China at the moment, because for many countries in the world, there is no alternative to the PRC as a source of investment, a source of trade opportunities, a source of international assistance, and a source of lending. Okay, let me just move for the last few minutes to Hong Kong and Taiwan. These are the two biggest immediate challenges, I think, to China's self-image and also China's global image as a rising power. The essence of the Hong Kong story is just this shocking and very unexpected, unpredicted resistance to the imposition of a Chinese, that is to say a PRC, political and social system in Hong Kong. Beijing's expectation from 1997 forward, so from the handover until now, was that Hong Kong would gradually melt into the rest of the PRC, that Hong Kong would gradually adopt a way of living, that Hong Kong people would adopt a way of living that was increasingly similar to the point of being identical to the way their counterparts in the rest of China live. What no one in Beijing expected was that we would get to 2020 and Hong Kong people would be resisting more strongly than ever their integration into the way of life of the rest of the PRC. And mainly what they are resisting is the expectation that they will give up their local identity, especially their local language, and that they will give up the political freedoms that they have enjoyed, mainly related to civil liberties like freedom of speech. And I think what we're seeing right now is that the Chinese government is unable to tolerate this open rejection of the PRC norms by the people of Hong Kong. So we see the PRC government pressuring Hong Kong authorities to bring Hong Kong into closer alignment with the rest of the PRC. And we see the refusal of Hong Kong people to accept that alignment and to give up without a fight. So the protests that have raged in Hong Kong for now almost a year have really raised the cost to Beijing of subduing Hong Kong to an incredibly high level. But what we also see is that Beijing appears willing to pay the cost, however high it gets, in order to crush this resistance and to ensure that Hong Kong does not continue to exist as a kind of fragment of PRC territory that lives outside the norms that are imposed in the rest of the country. So that's, in a nutshell, how I see the Hong Kong story. The Taiwan story is similar in some ways. As the PRC becomes more and more hardline, both internally and externally, Taiwan becomes more resistant to incorporation into the PRC. And in fact, even more resistant to measures that would just make the two sides closer in any way. So for many years, from about 1990 until around 2012, people in Taiwan were willing to open doors, open windows, open channels of connection to the PRC. It was when you talked about political incorporation that they became very resistant to engagement or entering that kind of dialogue. Now, you don't have to be talking about political incorporation to be triggering this strong sort of Sinophobic response in Taiwan. Almost anything that seems likely to increase the influence, the leverage, the power, the very presence of the PRC in Taiwan provokes this strong kind of antipathy among Taiwan people. And I think where we see the real point of origin of this very high level of skepticism toward greater engagement with the PRC is around the time that Xi Jinping took office, so around 2012. And that was partly because Taiwanese people recognized that Xi Jinping might be a more ambitious and impatient leader in the mainland. But I think the main reason we saw this change around 2012 was that the relationship between Taiwan and China went from being a kind of one-way street where Taiwanese were going to the mainland to work, to invest, to set up businesses, and so on, to more of a two-way street where you saw at first tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands and then millions of PRC tourists and students coming to Taiwan. And the Taiwanese government began loosening restrictions on PRC money, that is investment coming into Taiwan. And I think the realization that it was no longer a one-way street where Taiwanese were going to the mainland, where they could sort of manage that relationship in ways that did not put Taiwan at risk, that was becoming a two-way street, and that China, that the PRC was entering Taiwan in very concrete ways. I think that's what really created the backlash that we saw in Taiwan. So now we have a government in Taiwan, President Tsai Ing-wen, elected in 2016 and re-elected in January of this year, that really has very little motivation to compromise with the PRC beyond, and this is very important, her determination and so far absolutely consistent policy of avoiding any provocation that would offer Beijing a justification for coercive action or even military action against Taiwan. So she's not done anything to provoke the PRC, nor though has she made many concessions to the PRC, because there's just very little appetite right now in Taiwan for engagement of any kind, given the level of hostility and the level of assertiveness that the PRC government is showing toward Taiwan, toward Hong Kong, and toward the larger world. And then you add to that this feeling of solidarity with the people of Hong Kong, which is manifesting itself now in the movement in Taiwan to create a refugee law that would legalize the status of Hong Kong people who need to get out of Hong Kong and would like to reside in Taiwan. Add that solidarity piece in, and Taiwan also has become a really sore point for Beijing. So these are two very sensitive places always for Beijing, Hong Kong and Taiwan. And now they're making common cause to frustrate Beijing's efforts to increase its hold over both of them. And so I think that makes this a really risky moment for the PRC. And as a result, it's a very risky moment for the rest of the world. And I had a little bit more to say about COVID, but I think we just have only about 25 minutes remaining. So rather than take up any more time talking about what is interesting to me, I'd like to invite your questions and talk about things that are interesting to you. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, I'm not sure that I'm on.
You are on, Tony.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. First of all, good morning, Dr. Rigger. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you. I would just like to alert our audience that to those who wish to submit a question for our guest, please be informed that we'll take all questions in the order in which they're received. So, Dr. Rigger, the first question that I have is to ask if indeed you may have had the opportunity to read Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. And if so, I suspect that the member is asking if you might be in concert with his perspective.
Yes, well, first of all, I want to say that Graham Allison was a proud member of the Davidson class of 1955 until transferred to some other institution of some small renown in the Northeast. But I've had the opportunity to meet him here on campus because he actually still is very active in his Davidson alumni class, which is an extraordinary group of men. At that time, Davidson was an all-male institution, which includes Weish Fowler, a great politician and statesman from the great state of Georgia. I understand and very much appreciate Professor Allison's effort to theorize about the rise of new powers in the global system and to apply the logic of the ancient world. So the Thucydides concept of, a rising power inevitably comes into conflict with the existing power of the time, and that the most dangerous moment is when the rising power is approaching the power of the existing great power in the system. And, you know, he's done an incredible job in the book. And also there's this amazing website at Harvard where they are constantly updating the information that informs the book, where I think it's important. And I think, you know, the more measured synopsis of the book would certainly include this element. I don't think that, I think sometimes people interpret the Thucydides trap argument, Dr. Allison's argument, as a kind of prediction of an inevitable result, that the US and China are inevitably going to come into conflict. And I think the motivation for the study and for the book itself was actually to ward off or fend off or prevent this kind of confrontation. So I think confrontation is never inevitable. And so I appreciate this sophisticated effort to point us at a way of understanding what is happening that allows us to exit the spiral of conflict before it reaches the point of no return. So, you know, I don't think that conflict is inevitable. Even now, even given the leadership in the US and China, which seems on both sides really bent on a confrontation, I don't actually think either side wants a confrontation. And so I am still hopeful and fairly confident that it can be avoided. Thank you.
I see. Our next question. My understanding is that China historically saw itself as a kingdom to which regional powers owed fealty as a sort of feudal vassals or little brothers. But US policy seems to interpret China's current global ambitions as being expansionist, even imperialist. How connected are China's current global ambitions to its historical view of the world? And to what extent does the US misunderstand this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic and a difficult one. You know, this is another thing that China specialists debate a lot. I mean, I think most of us who are political scientists are pretty cautious about ever interpreting, you know, historical patterns as necessarily driving or even informing to a great extent contemporary political behavior. That said, it does seem that the PRC recognizes that it is the inheritor of a civilization that has a long history and that has had a great deal of regional influence for many centuries, and that therefore it is incumbent upon them as the leaders of the inheritor of that great tradition to uphold the greatness of the tradition, both internally and also externally. But I also think, you know, we would have to go back to the Mongol dynasty, and the Mongols were not anybody's idea of Chinese, right? The Mongols were what previous Chinese dynasties before the 13th century had been fortifying their country against. But we have to go back to the Mongol dynasty to find the influence of any Chinese state extending across Central Asia into Europe. You know, we can talk about the Silk Road, but the Silk Road was not a political tool of statecraft in the way that the Belt and Road Initiative is. So I would say, while I don't think that Beijing intends to have a political presence or in any kind of recognizably colonial sense in Central Asia or in Africa or in South Asia, I think it is finding itself, not by design, but by accident, forced to make some of those decisions. So, for example, it now has a military, a naval base in Djibouti, in Africa. And it is looking at very difficult choices in terms of how to recover its investment or loan payments, loans that have been extended. Should we take collateral? Should we, what tools of statecraft and power are we going to use to actually get our money back? And those questions can introduce some ideas or practices that may begin to look more like traditional colonialism than anybody in Beijing ever thought they would be looking at, if that makes any kind of sense.
It does. And certainly if we were to move even further south, China's a recent acquisition of the port city in Sri Lanka would suggest and opens us up to the next question. What may be Beijing's greatest concerns about India under Modi's leadership? We're talking about the Indo-Pacific region now and China.
Yeah, I think, India-China relations have been fraught for a very long time. And they have, the flashpoints have been kind of strange, these border regions, which seem like places that, nobody would ever want to go. The ongoing tension over Tibet and Tibetans, they feel like they have a kind of geostrategic resonance, but in a very old-fashioned way. I mean, like, who needs a little bit of territory in the Himalaya mountains in order to feel secure in the age of, in the nuclear weapons era? So what I wonder is whether or not the tensions between India and China that manifest themselves in places like their shared border region are in fact tensions over the reality that these are the two largest nations by population in the world, and they are adjacent. And it is very difficult to imagine both of them achieving a high standard of living without major changes to how the world imagines a high standard of living, right? So they are economic competitors, inevitably, and that economic competition makes it impossible for them to set aside the other issues or to tamp down the other issues that confront them. And then you also have Modi as a strong nationalist and a very kind of ethno-nationalist. His concept of Indian nationality is very similar to the Chinese Communist Party's notion of Chinese nationality, increasingly demanding compliance with or integration, assimilation to an ethnic notion of what Chinese identity is, an ethnic notion of what Indian identity is. That similarity, though, puts them at odds because, two nationalists in very large countries next to each other, that's also going to be make it harder to look past all the sources of division and find ways to get along.
Two nuclear powers.
Yes. And Pakistan too, we can't forget Pakistan in there.
That's the third
also.
leg of the stool. That is correct. Next question. How will Boris Johnson's announcement yesterday impact how many people leave Hong Kong and the international pressure that countries can place on the PRC?
Yeah, that was a big surprise. I think something happened to the Prime Minister when he got COVID.
It's an interesting way of putting it.
People, there's 30,000 who hold this particular kind of document that gives them access for 6 months to, and then they moved it to a year, and then he comes out with 3 million Hong Kong people. There are only 7 million people in Hong Kong. So he's talking about taking half of them. You know, Taiwan and Taiwan, maybe she'll take another million and to replace the million Taiwanese that allegedly are living in mainland China. You know, I don't know. I don't know whether he means it. I don't know whether he can get away with it. I mean, was not Brexit about reducing immigration into the UK? So I don't know what Boris Johnson is talking about, but it certainly was the strongest statement of solidarity with the Hong Kong people that a Western leader could have made. So we'll see. As far as putting pressure on Beijing, I don't think it puts a lot of pressure on Beijing because there's nothing the Beijing government would like better than for the Hong Kong people to leave Hong Kong so that they could have it.
We're coming.
People are not wanted or needed in order for the future that is envisioned for Hong Kong in Beijing to come to fruition.
We're coming up to that moment where we may have to leave in several minutes. So we're going to squeeze in a couple of quick questions, and maybe if you can just right off the top of your head, give us some rather short answers. Sorry. Many now see the Belt and Road Initiative as a means of military expansion as opposed to economic development. And this member would like to know your thoughts.
Okay, I don't think that it is intended as a means of military expansion, but I think what the PRC is coming to recognize is that when you put your assets at a distance, you put them at risk and you lose control over that risk. And so suddenly you come under pressure, you begin to receive a demand for a level of protection of those assets that you may not ever have imagined you were going to be called on to provide. So this is another sense in which, you know, I think the Communist Party leadership may be being pulled into commitments that it actually would prefer not to have. I think they may have some military, you know, some expansionist ideas, but those are very close to China. You know, they don't want to be fighting wars in Africa, I promise you. And if they end up fighting wars in Africa, that will be a disaster for the Chinese leadership.
We have a long number of questions, which is great, but we only have less than 3 minutes. So real quick, there's one organization that's remained silent in all of this, at least for many Americans on Main Street. The 1997 agreement safeguarding Hong Kong promising autonomy was sanctified in the United Nations. What obligation does the United Nations have to forcibly speak to the Chinese Communist Politburo about the sanctity of international agreements?
You know, I think this incident, this event, this moment in history shows the weakness of the United Nations in the face of certain kinds of challenges. You know, China is a UN Security Council member. It has veto power over everything. It's not going to sanction itself. So sadly, I'm not sure there's much the UN that we can expect the UN to do, even if we would hope that it could.
We have less than a minute. Vietnam's economy is booming. How are China and Vietnam getting along in the region at the moment? And how does America play into this?
Yeah, you know, a lot of companies that and individuals that are worried about the situation within China are now thinking about moving there, and also the trade war, thinking about moving or have already moved manufacturing operations to Vietnam. Vietnam's very interesting because the Vietnamese leadership, the Vietnamese government is still doing this, you know, socialist brethren thing with Beijing, but the Vietnamese population is increasingly anti-China. There were anti-Chinese riots in Vietnam a couple of years ago, and there is really no love lost between the two. I think this is a source of enormous frustration to Beijing that, you know, a country that fought in Vietnam for more than a decade is treated as a safer partner than China. They cannot understand it. And I think this is where we have to recognize the role that geography plays, and to some extent history, because while the US was in Vietnam for a decade or so, China has been hanging over and leaning into Vietnam for centuries. But, you know, this is just another frustration for Beijing to acknowledge that, you know, even their closest neighbors with which they have long history do not necessarily see them as a benign force at this moment.
Thank you. We have so many more questions for you, but alas and alack, we've run out of time and Dr. Kennedy has to sum up. Thank you so much for appearing, and I turn the session over to Dr. Kennedy at this point in time. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much, Shelley. Before I close this section, I would be interested in hearing from you how China's recent assertion of authority in the area of security affairs over Hong Kong plays on the concept of one country, two systems.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the one country, two systems concept is dead, because the idea of one country, two systems was that Hong Kong would be governed separately, you know, that Hong Kong would have a very high degree of autonomy. And the fact that the National People's Congress is going to pass a law that is dispositive in Hong Kong, most of the Western and Hong Kong lawyers that I've read on this topic say this is pretty much the end of one country, two systems. One country, two systems, though, was already pretty dead in its primary target, which has always been Taiwan, right? The one country, two systems formula was created with Taiwan in mind. And the idea was that Hong Kong would be the demonstration site. And it didn't take the total failure and sort of the admission of failure from Beijing of one country, two systems to persuade people in Taiwan that it was not going to work for them. So there's never been any enthusiasm for one country, two systems in Taiwan at all. No Taiwanese political party has ever endorsed one country, two systems.
Thank you very much, Shelley. Thank you so much for all of your insightful comments. We now have certainly a much better understanding of the contemporary environment in which Hong Kong and Taiwan find themselves, especially with the rise of China politically and economically. It's certainly been a pleasure to have you join us today, and we wish you the very best in the future. And for those of you who also have joined us today, for your own safety and the safety of others, please follow guidelines during this pandemic of physical distancing and wearing masks as appropriate. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. We wish you good health and great happiness. Good afternoon.